welcome to another episode of Real Talk Friends. We are here today with Kerry Muhlestein, guest on the show. We're excited to have him. Author of many books, but one recently that I just wanted to show you the size of this baby. And it's Learning to Love Isaiah, and it's just a wonderful verse-by-verse commentary on the book of Isaiah. And so it's not something you're going to sit down and read just in one setting, but a wonderful help, right? If you want to read through the Isaiah chapters and get something out of it that you didn't get before, it goes verse by verse and offers commentary on the margins. And I just thought it was an awesome experience. But welcome, Kerry.
Thank you. Thank you.
So excited to have you because you're kind of with me when I'm studying my scriptures, and now to have you here so we can ask you some of those questions that for the non-lovers of Isaiah and the lovers of Isaiah. We're going to cover
hoping to get everyone to be lovers of Isaiah.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
And whether or not you're a lover of Isaiah, I think we all feel obligated to understand Isaiah a little bit, right?
It's a commandment.
Yeah, it is a commandment, and we'll get to that. And I just love how this book, for me, is just a wonderful tool to kind of immerse yourself into it. But we wanted to maybe just start, Kerry, by you telling the audience just a little bit about yourself. And you have a PhD in Egyptology, first of all, and just kind of tell us about your history and where you've been and how you've gotten up to this point.
Sure, yeah. So I have a fairly useless PhD that you can't really get a real job with, but you can do fun stuff with it, right?
It sounds like it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Utah. I went to BYU, started out studying psychology, and I did get my degree in psychology, but partway through really switched to Hebrew Bible, and I got a minor in Hebrew. Did my master's there, also in ancient Near Eastern studies in Hebrew Bible. But by that point, I'd really gotten into loving ancient Egypt.
Why? What do you remember? What things really drew you in the most?
Oh, yeah. So as I mean, some of it is just starting my love affair with the Old Testament. So those are my two areas that I love: the Old Testament. Well, I love the New Testament too, but I really fell in love with the Old Testament. And because I found that if I understood the Old Testament, and I still teach this and believe this to anyone, if you understand the Old Testament, it helps you understand the New Testament, it helps you understand the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, obviously the Pearl of Great Price. All those other biblical books presuppose that you understand the Old Testament. And so, or I should say, all those scriptural books. Every single one of them, they presuppose you understand the Old Testament. So if you don't, then you're not going to get it. So I wanted to get into the Old Testament so I could get everything else. And I came to understand that if you really want to understand the Old Testament, you have to understand not just like the Hebrew language, and you actually can understand it fairly well without understanding Hebrew, but you have to understand the language of symbolism. And you can't understand it well if you don't understand the language of symbolism. So as I started to study the symbolism of the ancient Near East to try and understand the Bible a little bit better, I thought, well, if you're going to study symbolism, you got to look at ancient Egypt. They do symbols more and better than anyone.
Absolutely.
And once I started to get into that, I was just hooked. I just fell for it. Just such a fascinating and amazing culture with it's so rich in their ability to communicate, both because their language, they write with pictures, right? So their ability to use symbols is incredible. And so my happiest place is when we have the world of Egypt and the world of the Bible combining, which is in lots of cool places, including Isaiah, Book of Abraham, and Exodus story and things like that. So that's where I'm really happy, and that's how I got into it. So.
That's awesome.
So you did a little bit more beyond that. Just with that study, you've also been a part of some other amazing projects. Want to share a little?
Like the BYU Egypt Excavation project.
Yeah, so after I finished getting my PhD at UCLA in Egyptology with a secondary emphasis, Hebrew language and literature, and I taught at BYU Hawaii for a while, but when I came to BYU Provo, I was invited to work with Wilfred Griggs on an excavation that he'd been doing for years and years. And then as he retired, I became the director of that. So I've been with the excavation since 2007. I've been the director since 2011. We work on a pyramid. I'll be there in just a few weeks, excavating the southern side of that pyramid. There's a huge Greco-Roman cemetery with lots of mummies. So when you think Egypt, people usually think mummies and pyramids, and that's actually what I do at those excavations. It's fun stuff.
So tell me how close I am. I'll picture you in a few weeks going to the site, and you are dressed like Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
John's
just like it, except for the part that I'm not. Yeah. Other than that, it's exactly
the hat, at least the hat.
Actually, I do have a hat like that because it turns out. So I was wearing like some camel leather hats and stuff. I'm dedicated to having some pretty wide brimmed hats that keep the sun off my face because I'd rather come home to my family. So. as I tried a whole bunch of hats, and I had a friend that had this Indiana Jones hat that I was kind of making fun of, but one day I was teasing him and I was wearing it, and I was like, well, that's actually the most comfortable hat I've ever worn in my life. And it looked like it was going to be
So it's
hot.
practical.
But yeah, it's not hot. It's
Who'd have
comfortable. So I've tried a whole bunch of hats, and I'm sticking with that
Okay.
hat. It is really
See,
comfortable.
look at-
It's not the
look
true
at
Indiana
look at-
Jones style hat, though. I have the Australian Indiana
Okay.
Jones because it has a
We'll take
wider
it.
brim to get the sun off my face.
But no whip.
No whip.
Revolver?
No revolver.
So you don't
I
have
am
to fire
surrounded
off.
by guards that have guns,
Okay.
so I don't need the
So
revolver
potential
myself,
threat
yeah.
from evil empires. See, there's a lot of
I
parallels.
am.
I love how
Yeah.
you're unearthing that. Did you like how I did that?
Yeah,
The unearthing?
that
like
was
it.
good.
I like it.
That was good.
I just want, just for our listeners' sake here, I just want to just quickly mention the languages that Kerry has
Oh, this will put him to
one
sleep.
level or another of proficiency in. I felt like a small, ignorant, naive child when I read these. Okay, you're going to have to help me with some of these,
It's real
Kerry.
talk right now.
We've got Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ugaritic?
Ugaritic, yeah.
Ugaritic?
What is that?
That's a Canaanite
Or-
language. It's actually fairly
Canaanite,
similar to Hebrew, only written more like
Thanks,
Akkadian, just north of
Wow.
Israel and Syria area.
Phoenician?
Yeah, Phoenician, yeah.
Phoenician, sorry. Moabite.
They
Coptic.
speak that in Phoenix. That's what they speak in.
We're children.
Yeah, man.
German, French, and
Yeah,
additional
that's just
courses
reading German,
in
French.
Greek.
Oh,
and,
just reading it.
Greek and Akkadian. Man,
Wow.
Kerry.
I can fake it with the best of them.
Well, and
Anyway, that's
and
just awesome.
I think it's so wonderful to have you here to kind of have a real talk conversation around. I love your testimony of the Old Testament. We started this season 3. We don't know when people are watching this. It could be way past that. But we're studying the Old Testament this year. And I said on one episode, the Old Testament is the OG. Like if we start there, it creates that foundation for us.
Absolutely.
But for those that maybe feel like it's more of a stumbling block to be studying the Old Testament, specifically to be dealing with Isaiah, instead of this stepping stone closer to God, not to build a Tower of Babel. Like we don't want to, we don't want to repeat a problem story. But what would you say to those about that are more in the fear? They're not in the middle of this falling in love relationship with something that really is foundational.
So I'd say a number of things, and you're speaking to my heart. Like I this is what I'm this year more passionate about than anything is helping people learn to love the Old Testament. That's why learning to love Isaiah is part of that. But I've feared the same thing, that as we've been doing Come Follow Me, and my sense is, I don't know, but my sense is that as members of the church, we've really gotten into the scriptures more than ever before.
Right.
And we've been having a love affair with the scriptures, and it's been going great. And I feared it would be a little bit like in the Book of Mormon, where you're loving the Book of Mormon and you hit the Isaiah chapters, right? And then people are like, oh, okay, I'm really kind of done. I was afraid it would be that way in Come Follow Me, that we'd get to Old Testament and be done. I am tired of this and lose our scripture love momentum. So I've just kind of doing everything I can. I've started... I'm a terrible web designer, but I started with a little website called outofthedust.org just to throw everything I could think of on there to help people with understanding the Old Testament. I was stupid enough to begin my own podcast because I don't have so much extra time, right? But I'm just doing everything I can to help people understand the Old
In
Testament.
between writing this here.
Yeah, and I'm trying to draw on everything from, I've been teaching Old Testament since 1994 at BYU or
Wow.
BYU or somewhere. And so I'm drawing on everything I can from my students to figure out what is it that will help people. And some of it is to just get rid of the fear, right? It's not as weird as you think it is. We make it worse than it is. But some of it is also to accept it for what they're trying to present themselves as. And some of the difficulty we have with the Old Testament is because we want nice, clean, kind of sanitized versions of things. So let me just contrast Book of Mormon and Old Testament for a second. Book of Mormon is very much out of an Old Testament world. And again, if you understand the Old Testament, you're going to see tons of stuff in the Book of Mormon you haven't seen before and understand it better. But we have Mormon, who is a fantastic editor. And he really gives us this nice kind of clean version, and he doesn't tell us all of the worst things that Captain Moroni ever did, or all of the worst things that Alma. Well, he actually does tell you some of the worst things Alma did, but he doesn't do that. Whereas whoever is putting the Old Testament together, there's probably several different editors, they are showing you everything. Right.
The
It's the whole dirty
dysfunction.
land. Yeah. Which for me is refreshing. So
beauty of it. I agree.
yeah, we get into Genesis and honestly some of my heroes are Abraham and Jacob. But I love to see that sometimes their family life was difficult and messy.
Yeah.
Yes.
And sometimes they weren't quite sure how to make this work the right way, and they tried it this way, and it kind of worked, and it kind of didn't, and this way, and they made mistakes, and yet they were determined to serve God at all hazards, and sometimes they did it really well, sometimes less well, and then they did it better again, and because they were just trying to keep the covenant, God kept working with them,
Right.
and they became great beings, already exalted, even though their life was messy. And that gives me hope for me, for my family, for friends that I have and their families. I mean, we all live in a messy world with messy families and whatever else. And if we'll look at that, and also what I was talking about earlier, look at the idea of symbolic action. Well, symbols in general and symbolic action, right? We have to understand symbols. And these people spoke through symbols more than anything else. So if you look for symbolic action and you'll look for the warts and all kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
They shared their stories in the book of Judges where they say, this is us at our worst.
Yeah.
When the whole nation was messing up in a lot of ways. And then look how, we tried again. If we'll look for that, and one last thing is to look for God's patience with them and his messages of hope. Actually, my favorite thing I ever wrote, I published it with Covenant a long time ago. I think it's only available as an ebook now, but it's called Return Unto Me, but it was a book called, the subtitle is Messages of Love and Hope from the Old Testament. I think you see the message of mercy and hope more in the Old Testament than all the rest of Scripture. Because however many times they mess up, God works with them again, and he gives them another chance. And so often we see, okay, well, God had to punish them, and we kind of stop the story there. Instead of saying, oh, well, but look, then he gives them another chance. Oh, look, he gives them and another, unendingly another chance.
Yeah.
That's really comforting to me.
I think that's what tone we've tried to have for this
Yeah,
season on the show,
absolutely.
especially that the dysfunction gives us hope that God will work with us
Yeah.
Right.
wherever we're at. And I love that you do a shout out to editors. We share the same editor, Sam, and she's
yeah.
a fan of the show. And so I
She's the
always
best.
say, literally, she is the best.
Yeah.
That I love that point that you bring out, that the Book of Mormon has, had some editors that went through piles and piles of records and decided these are the highlights.
Right.
And the Old Testament maybe doesn't have enough of Sam in there
Yeah.
to kind of, make it more palatable at times or easy to digest. But is that where the gift is?
In some ways it is, right? That we get to see the whole thing, the whole person rather than part of the person. And I think honestly, I think it's true of Jehovah or Christ as well. I feel like if you just study the Gospels, and we should study the Gospels, and it's beautiful and powerful, but you only get to know some
Right.
of who Christ is, right? You need to see how Christ presents himself in all of Scripture, and then you really start to know who he is. And I have to say, there's a part of me, I see so much in my students and working with youth and so on, a lot of anxiety, depression, and there are a lot of things behind that. But there's a part of me that wonders if part of that isn't that we're not focusing on a God who comes out and saves the way we do in the Exodus story, right? Now that takes the destruction of some Egyptians. But God saves his people, and we see it again and again. The saving always involves conquering something. But we too often just focus on the warm and fuzzy, he's there for me, and that's true, and we need that. But we also need to know when I am being oppressed, whether that's by anxiety, whether that's by addiction, whether that's by my fallen nature, whatever it is, I have a God who comes out and conquers what is oppressing me and can save me no matter who the foe is or how difficult it is. He can save me. When we have faith in that kind of a Christ, then we have a lot
The
more
God
hope.
of Sabaoth,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, the God of hosts, Sabaoth, yeah.
And whether that means, I'm thinking of now a Book of Mormon allusion as well to the same concept, where whether that means coming and literally taking you out of Egypt to somewhere new, or just strengthening you and comforting you in the trenches to continue to persevere from day to day, right?
Yeah.
That's the God we worship,
Yeah.
someone who has the ability to do whatever we need in that moment,
Yep. Yeah.
I loved how when you were describing sort of the strengths of the Old Testament, how that resonated so much with sort of the cycle we see in Isaiah, right?
Yeah.
And I know that plenty of people could argue this, and they're welcome to, but I can't think of any, for me, my favorite Old Testament book that captures what you were talking about, how we struggle, but God always offers that comfort and is always there to help preserve us and strengthen us and help us learn from our mistakes and grow. I think Isaiah is beautiful when it comes to that.
Yeah.
And so that's why I love this book of yours. And I thought maybe I share something with you that when I was a teenager and I first started reading the scriptures, it wasn't until it was after I graduated high school, honestly. I was like 18. And I started the Book of Mormon, right? And I got to the Isaiah chapters.
Yeah.
And I was just like, what are these? And so I went to a priesthood leader, so I don't want to be too specific. And I said, hey, what do you do with these chapters? And he said, oh, yeah, most people I know would just skip them.
Oh, no.
Okay, and I was like,
That's what makes me cry.
I said, oh, okay. So I just skipped them. Next 2 years, I moved from Georgia, and I was living out here in Utah, and in the scriptures again, read the Book of Mormon multiple times, just skipped Isaiah chapters. I was on a mission in the Philippines. Before I'm reading the Book of Mormon again, and I get to that famous verse, 35:23:1, is that right?
I think so.
Where Jesus says, I have it there. Yep, 35:23:1, Jesus says,
Condemns you, John.
I command you, right? A commandment I give unto you to study the words of Isaiah, for greater the words of Isaiah. And I just had this moment like, oh my goodness. Of all the authors, of all the books, of all the scriptures that Jesus could have commanded us to study, and I would say the Book of Mormon is specifically for a Latter-day audience, obviously. Mm-hmm. If the foreknowledge of God, he has Jesus say in that moment, hey, Latter-day audience, what you need most is found in Isaiah. Go get it. When I got that vision, I was like, okay, I hear you. And I said, I will not move on from any chapter of Isaiah until I found at least one thing that I think is a profitable takeaway.
Good.
That's where my journey started personally.
That's a great place to
Yeah,
be.
just a one takeaway approach.
Right, just just really easy. And so that's what I wanted to ask you about, Kerry. I mean, you're as proficient in Isaiah as probably anyone on planet Earth at this point. My question for you is, what would you say to the people in our audience who are just sort of that traditional blue-collar type that's never going to really sit down and go through
Or have skipped
a
over
big
it
commentary,
for their whole
right?
life.
And all they have in their hectic day is all they have are the scriptures and prayer as their tools. What message do you feel confident the prophet Isaiah contains that they can just access without having to have a PhD in this or that or a knowledge of all these different languages? Right. What message do you think that they could still get loud and clear if they just approach this prayerfully? And what maybe tips could you get them, little things to get them in the right direction?
So first of all, let me say, I hope that for whoever they are, at whatever level, that this book is helpful and accessible, right? That
it is very accessible.
You've got the King James Version in one, so it's not as big as it looks because there's a lot of white space. King James Version on one side and commentary on the other, and that it helps them. And we have indexes in there for when you're doing the Book of Mormon. So if you're reading in the Book of Mormon, you're like, oh, I'm reading First Nephi, whatever. There's an Isaiah, because there are actually allusions to Isaiah people don't even know, and you can go in and find it. So I hope it's helpful. But to get back to your question, there are a couple of things. One, Isaiah wants us to understand how bad it is when we are not keeping the covenant and how great it is when we are. And he's a master at using imagery to help us feel it. He doesn't want us to just understand it, he wants us to feel it. And so he creates images, and sometimes it's hyperbole or exaggeration, right? But he creates images that help you to feel. So you'll read some of the passages where he talks about the cry goes up and it's heard, and you may not know, you could slow down. Like one of my big pieces of advice would be to slow down and look into things, right?
Which is what happened to me. I had to slow down.
Yeah. You don't do Isaiah fast. I think you get more out of it if you say, okay, I'm going to do 2 verses today and do it slowly. Then I'm going to do a chapter and see what I get out of it, right? But either way, whatever works for you. But you could say, he says that the cry is heard from here to here. Today you can look it up online and get an idea of how far that is, right? I've done it for you, so you don't have to, but you could do that. And then you say, okay, wait, he's saying they hear them crying like 30 miles away. Probably not realistic, but what's he trying to get me to feel there? And, he's trying to get me to feel this is serious mourning. What they've gone through because they broke the covenant is really, really difficult and hard. And so allow yourself to feel the imagery that he's trying to get you to feel, those symbols that we're talking about. And so that's the next thing. I'll hit on symbols in just a second. But he'll have equally exaggerated, but I think it's eventually actually true, imagery about how happy you are and how blessed and wonderful it is when you're keeping the covenant. And right, that God carries you up on eagle's wings. What a great image, right? And again, it's his imagery that helps you to feel. Just think about what he's trying to help you understand when God's just going to bear you up and away. Beautiful stuff. Yeah. I'd also say focus on the symbols and slow down and unpack those symbols. When you come across anything he's saying, think, is this a symbol? Yeah. Probably. He's talking about threshing. Well, find out what threshing is. And again, I do it for you, but you can get online and just look up threshing.
Well, and if people are on their phone reading it, it's just a matter of a swipe to Google, and there you go.
That's exactly right. And just, okay, this is what threshing is, so understand the literal symbol, and then say, okay, what does this have to do with what he's trying to show me? And then, one more step, Isaiah very, very seldom prophesies about just one time period. And so try and understand the different time periods he might apply. And if you don't get any others, ask yourself, how might this apply to me and my time period? But I get more out of it if I try and understand what the original context was. So that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. I think we have tons of great stuff. Latter-day Saints write more about Isaiah than just about anyone else per capita, right? I mean, we write and write and write about it.
Because we have a commandment.
That's exactly right. And we get this kind of guilt complex about, I'm supposed to like this, but I'm not liking it, right? And I don't get anything. That's why I want, this really is designed, especially if you read the stuff at the beginning, whatever, to help you to learn to love Isaiah. That's what I hope happens, right? But I have lots of friends who've written fantastic stuff, but I found most of the commentaries focus primarily on the millennial or the meridian of time. And I find if I understand what's going on in Isaiah's day, that I understand the others better. So I'll help you with that. You can do it on your own as well, but if you'll stop and ask, how might this have applied in Isaiah's day? But always ask that question, like you were saying, what can I take away for myself? How might this apply to me? There are always applications for you in there somewhere. And if you'll do those things, you'll get at least one takeaway every day, like you were saying.
I think it's a great reminder that when you're studying Isaiah specifically, it gives a time continuum that's you can apply it and understand the experience he was having and then extrapolate what it might mean for us today. But I think that's also the mind bender of it all. Yeah. Because you're also like, wait, is this prophecy? Did this already happen? Yeah. Is it happening now? Is it going to happen in the millennium? And so I think just kind of easing the burden of you may not, but like all other scripture, it is meant for our translation and interpretation. And so can the Spirit use the ingredients so that we receive that revelation we need that day and slowing it down? I love that. So you've already mentioned two of your favorites. You said Abraham and Jacob, but I'm going to push you if you had to choose a top three. Like if it was going to be the boy band of the Old Testament or the girl band, because we've got some great women in the Old Testament.
That is true. But if I was going to choose my top three, I do love a lot of people in the Old Testament.
Okay.
But I'd go Abraham, Moses, and Isaiah.
Okay.
Which
Can
is
you give us
pretty good. I mean, it's hard to beat those three, right?
Who's your top woman? I'm going to...
Rebecca.
Yeah. Why?
Although I love Ruth. Ruth is actually, maybe Ruth. They're tied. And Mary's right.
We gotta think it.
Yeah, so Rebecca, just because she is so quick to do whatever needs to be done, and she gets revelation from God, and she's going to make it happen. And I mean,
by all means necessary.
By all means necessary.
That's exactly right.
The goat's hair.
Because she is going to keep those covenants, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Covenant keepers. So this is another thing, and it's why I've written. I have a book on the covenant. Right, God will prevail. This book has plenty about covenant in it as well. I mean, I wrote this over like 4 or 5 years, so I wrote God Will Prevail while I was writing this and so on, but and they really influenced each other. I have come to understand that when you recognize the Abrahamic or New and Everlasting Covenant, you find it everywhere in Scriptures. And once you catch onto that theme, I mean, it really is everywhere. Yeah. And it changes the way you understand Scripture, but it also just makes, and you can see this with President Nelson, you can so see this, it makes the idea of being conscious of your covenant and conscious of being a covenant keeper become really meaningful, to where that's something that I think about all the time. I'll just tell you, it's been probably for like a year and a half now, the first one of the first things I think of when I pray every morning is just, thank you for being willing to covenant with us.
Wow.
I'm so grateful that God will tie himself to us in that way and have that relationship with us.
That's awesome.
And so that covenant keeping just becomes really big for me. And you see that with Ruth, you see it with Rebecca, you see it with Abraham, Moses, Isaiah. These are covenant keepers, and I'm into covenant keepers. So.
And they're covenant keepers that have to claim the blessings before they manifest, which to me feels very relevant to my life.
Yeah, that's how it works for everyone, right?
Right,
But you're
for
right.
sure.
When you see that example, and really, honestly, so often we find people who want the blessings before they keep the covenant, or they want the answers, right?
DoorDash to deliver it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're wondering
DoorDash
about
blessings.
answers, and they want the answers before they're willing to pay the price, right?
Right.
And to some degree, that's the what you have to do for the scriptures in general, and Isaiah in particular. One of the reasons that
point.
Isaiah has so much to yield is because you have to put so much into it.
So you're saying like it's a deep well, but it's worth the dive.
That's
because
exactly right.
You're not gonna just get the surface. You're gonna get layer after layer, which is probably why you love it.
Yeah, that is why.
You are
It
that
reminds
guy.
me, and I wish I could think of.
That's a
of-
compliment.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
I took it as such.
Okay.
I wish I could think of who this is. I can't remember. But a philosopher, and I think it was a Catholic priest or someone, but who also was into doing stuff outdoors. And he said, God holds his and this is a terrible paraphrase of it, but God reserves his greatest beauty for those who are willing to pay the greatest price to get there. And he's talking about like mountain lakes
Yeah,
and mountain
sure.
peaks and things.
Yeah.
And it's true when you think
Beautiful
about that. Like
metaphor,
the greatest things are not easy to get to.
Yeah.
And that's true of life in general and true of
They're
the
the low
scriptures and
traffic
covenants.
areas, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, there was something that struck me as I went through this commentary recently, especially. Referenced earlier my first time taking the challenge that the Savior gave us, on 3 Nephi 23 was on my mission. For me, what I started to uncover a pattern. And I was so happy to see that you mentioned the same pattern, but called it by a different name in your commentary, which I love because I love the idea of people searching for truth all around the world, right? Revelation scattered among us. And you find this truth. I find the same truth over here, and the way we phrase it or frame it is similar but different, but we can
Right.
tell it's the same truth. And for me, I kept seeing a pattern. Sometimes it happened multiple times in one chapter. Sometimes it happened over multiple chapters.
Yeah.
But it was what I came to call the hope cycle of Isaiah, where, to keep it, and this is oversimplification, but you'll know what I'm talking about, where God will say, hey, everybody, what you're doing is not covenant keeping. You're breaking the covenant. You're making poor choices, less effective. If you keep doing that, this is going to happen. And it's going to happen for as long as you continue to do that.
Yeah.
But I want you to know that I'm here for you.
Yeah.
And when you choose, you or your future posterity,
Right.
when you choose to turn to me, I'm going to fix this, and I'm going to heal you, and I'm going to redeem you. I knew you were a transgressor from the womb. None of this is surprising me.
Yeah.
I'm not panicking at all, but I just want you to know I'm watching. I'm here for you. When you choose to come out of that garbage, I'm here for you. I called it the hope cycle. What did you call it in your commentary?
I called it the covenant corruption cycle,
Yeah.
which actually, again, as I was working on this in my book on the Abrahamic covenant called God Will Prevail, at the same time, it just became so clear.
Yeah.
We call it the pride cycle in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
In the Old Testament, we often call it the idolatry cycle. But in my mind, it was pretty clear that what it's all about is when you keep the covenant, you get these amazing blessings. And part of the purpose of covenant is to help you recognize that your blessings are tied to God. But when you forget that and you start to think you're getting the blessings because you're all big and bad, then you stop keeping the covenant. And then God's going to want you to keep the covenant again. So he'll humble you, as you said, for as long as possible. But there's always him working to get you back. So I love what you said. Again, I talked about that book called Return Unto Me because that's the same emphasis,
It's
right?
just so beautiful.
Please, I'm here. I'm waiting for you to come back to me at any point, at any time. He talks about, I'll preserve a remnant. If that's what it takes, if you're going to die off before you come back, I'll preserve a remnant of your
I'll
seed so that they can
send
come
the
back.
Assyrians if necessary.
That's exactly right. Yeah, send the Assyrians, I'll send the Babylonians, I'll send the Egyptians. I mean, he lists all sorts of people he's going to send. Whatever it takes. Right in the Book of Mormon, I'll send the Lamanites.
I'll send you into the wilderness.
That's exactly right, yeah. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll keep working with you, and I'm here as soon as you return unto me.
I love it
So
much.
I wrote a similar book at the same time it was released, When You Choose to Let God Prevail, and it's a very small booklet, but I love the idea of what you share in this commentary, what you just shared with our viewers, is that God honors that agency. And so when I was working on the same principle and trying to flesh it out, it was about agency.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you see that God isn't panicked,
Yeah.
and he's willing to let the rope go long, so to speak.
Yeah.
And say, okay, you tried experimenting upon the word that way, and then when
How was
you
that?
choose to let God prevail, I'll be here for that cycle. It's always about agency. And yet, as a mother, let me just be honest, I like to pray away the agency of those that I birthed. Let me just say that.
I've said it all.
Full
I've said it
disclosure.
so many times lately, like, if I could just have my kids' agency for like 20 minutes, I'll fix
that's
a lot of
it.
stuff.
And then we'll magically.
Just 20.
Yeah. Thank goodness God is wiser than we are,
Right.
and more patient,
And
and He knows
non-panicked.
it's going to work out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, something, a productive exercise that I've done myself and recommended to others, and they've had similarly sort of good experiences with, is just as you go through Isaiah, if nothing else, just whenever you read a verse or set of verses that even remotely resemble hope, have a hopeful tone, just write hope in the margin. And I think all of us would be very surprised. I remember the first time I did that, I was like, oh my gosh.
Isaiah's hopeful.
I'm flipping through the
Oh,
Isaiah
like
chapters, I'm like,
crazy.
hope, 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 hope. It's everywhere.
Well,
and so I
and
love to see him
I
as sort of
agree.
this prophet of ultimate hope who doesn't hold back, right? But it's just like, God is so, he is so in love with you.
Yeah.
He's never going to give up on you. And he's always there for you as soon as you
It's
wish
the
to turn to
allegory
him.
of the vineyard for sure, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
he is going
He'll
to
never stop
graft
working
and
on that
dung
tree.
and
Yeah.
trim
Yeah.
and graft again if
Yes.
necessary.
Isaiah seems incapable of going on for too long about the bad stuff without throwing hope somewhere in the middle. Even if it's just, and you'll find this, like long verses about all the bad stuff, and then he's got to have like 2 verses. Don't worry, it's going to be okay in the end. Okay, let's get back to
Isn't
all
that
the
so
bad
funny?
stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. But he just throws it in all the time.
Yep.
He also does the same thing when he gets the long chapters of hope in the middle. He just has to throw into like 2 verses. Actually, if you don't keep the covenant, it's not going to work out this way. Okay, back to this and so on. But he just
The
he
ultimate
can't do
realist,
it.
maybe.
Yeah, maybe. But he always holds out that hope. And sometimes that's part of what is confusing sometimes for people, because sometimes he's in the midst of talking about all this stuff, and the only hope he can hold out is, in the millennium, this is going to work out. Okay, back to the bad
isn't that
stuff going
cool,
on
though?
right now.
Yeah.
It is
Isn't that cool?
fantastic.
A
And we
lot
just have to let
gets
him jump in
resolved
time
there.
as he looks for his hope. Yeah.
And for some things, it may, and what a great lesson for us to learn. Some of these things aren't going to work themselves out,
Yeah.
even in this lifetime.
Yeah.
For him, he's looking forward millennia, literally.
Yeah.
But for him, it's okay. Again, I've been wanting to say lately in my life, panic is not a fruit of the Spirit. And so I just don't get the feeling that God is panicking at all. And I think that Isaiah does a really job conveying that through his writings.
Yeah.
Can we end on a little interfaith conversation?
Sure.
You've traveled a lot.
Yeah.
You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. And I think the Old Testament is a beautiful opportunity to understand our Jewish brothers and sisters, our Muslim brothers and sisters. And I really love the opportunity that we have to learn, as John just referenced, that there's truth kind of scattered everywhere. And sometimes when you study another faith, all of a sudden you're like, wait, that 5 pillars of Islam sounds awfully familiar.
Yeah,
When I toured a mosque in Bahrain, I was like, gosh, this feels like the Mount Timpanogos Temple. Like all the symbolism feels so similar.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on what we can learn from those of other faiths, specifically Muslims and Jews, that I think play a significant role in the Old Testament this year as we're studying that?
I'm grateful you asked that question. That's been a big impact in my life and in the life of my family. I've twice had the chance to teach at the Jerusalem Center, BYU's Jerusalem Center in the West Bank in Jerusalem. And we live up on the Mount of Olives in what's called the Palestinian section of Jerusalem. But we're around Jews and Christians and Muslims and other Christians besides ourselves, other faiths, all the time. And so not only have I seen it impact me, but I've seen it impact my family. And maybe I can just share a couple stories from that have
Please.
made a big difference. I'm in Egypt as well, so I've had a lot of opportunity to be with Muslims, and I am so impressed with their devoutness. So impressed with how devout they are, with their goodness and their honesty. I could tell you stories about honesty that would just shock and surprise you, but I'd like to tell the story about my son, who at the time was 13, and he was in this school where he had Muslim and Jewish friends mostly. And, well, it was an Anglican school, so a bunch of Christians from different denominations. And, most of my kids, like I think most kids, Fast Sunday wasn't their favorite day of the month. Right?
Really?
Yeah.
My kids love it.
The Fossum children are extra special.
Yeah, they don't need food anyway. So, and it happened to be after a little while, we were only been there a little while, and it was hot. And Ramadan began, and this is when Muslims fast from sun up to sundown, right? And my son got back, and he said, I'm not going to complain about fasting anymore. And the best friend he'd made was Muslim, and he was assiduously observing Ramadan. And in PE that day, they'd run for a month.
A month.
Yeah. So in PE, they'd run. It was like for an hour and a half, they just did nothing but run in the 90-degree weather. And his friend did it without having any food that day and not drinking or anything. And my son was just like, I don't know what I'm complaining about. That's one devout guy, right? And you can't go to the Western Wall and not sense both their devotion, but also their joy in the Sabbath. And I can remember my children also saying, why are they singing? Why are they so happy? And I say, this is what the song that they sing is, they welcome the Sabbath in. They're so excited for the Sabbath to start. And they're like, I don't like the Sabbath that much. Why? And they're really touched by how they worship and the Lord on the Sabbath, and it makes them so happy, right? And that's something we can really learn. Maybe I'll just share one. I know you said Jews and Christians, but Jews and Muslims, but one of the most touching times our family ever had, first time we took them down into the old city. And so I've got a child who's 3 and 6 kids from 3 to 13. And we get into the Holy Sepulchre, and there's a stone there that is the traditional stone, and it's been worn away by pilgrims over 1,000 years, and they had to put a new slab on and stuff. But still, it's the stone that tradition holds Christ's body was laid on as they prepared it for burial. And typically, you go in there and you find people who are kneeling on it and praying, and they're putting their candles on it and so on, hoping that these candles will become sacred. And a lot of them are doing it because they have someone at home that needs to be healed or something. Just real devotion there. And our kids are watching and asking us, and we're talking about, well, this is because of how much they love Christ and the devotion they have for him and the faith they have that as Christ was resurrected, so we can be resurrected and hoped and healed and so on. And they said, can we go pray there? And we said, yeah. And it just so happened right then, everyone left, which never happens there, but everyone left. And so my 6 kids went, and it was just the 6 of them. And they started doing what everyone else had done, right? They were kneeling down and touching the stone and praying. And to begin with, I was like, I don't know, we don't really pray that way. That's a little bit weird. And I was about to go over to them and say, that's enough. Why don't we stop doing this? Let's go. And I had a really strong prompting, and it said, just leave them alone. I'm bearing testimony to them right now. Oh. And I looked at my wife, and worried that she was going to go interrupt them. And she was just having the same look, and we talked later, and she'd had the exact same experience. Like, she was thinking, maybe we shouldn't, and the Spirit said, leave them alone. Wow. And they had learned from the devotion of other Christians to really pray, and the Lord says, if you're praying, I'm bearing testimony, right? And so I think from all of these people, we can learn a lot.
It brings to mind, I've shared it before on Real Talk, what Elder Anderson invited us in General Conference, and I leapt from the couch, in my house, and I said to my family, did you just hear what Elder Anderson invited us to do? And my family's like, why are you freaking out? And he said, it is going to be a requirement that we link arms with other Christians to prepare for what's to come before the second coming. And I would just add to that, not to add to his words, but from our Muslim brothers and sisters who teach us diligence in prayer and in fasting, right?
I agree.
Our Jewish brothers and sisters that understand the Old Testament in Hebrew in a way that can enhance and increase our own faith. And what a beautiful window into experiences that maybe many of our listeners have never been able to have and will never have, thank you for sharing that experience with us. Anything else you want to?
No, I just love the idea that God is busy at work all around the world with all of his children, not just with an exclusive group we call the Latter-day Saints. He's busy at work with us too.
And he accepts devotion from anyone in whatever way they offer it.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, the millennium is not going to be all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So in case anyone's shocked by that, it's good to just know it now, right? Yeah. And to continue to learn. Where can people find you and understand more about you? We're going to put some links in the show notes for this book specifically, but...
So outofthedust.org is a good place, or my podcast, The Scriptures Are Real, where we try and just talk about things that have made the Scriptures become more real for people. Awesome. Those are probably the best places.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you for your work and your devotion and your faith, bringing the Spirit into the studio today and sharing this message that if you've fallen off the Old Testament wagon, get back on.
That's right.
Get back on and join us again for another episode of Real Talk Friends, and we'll see you again soon.
Do you like Real Talk? Come follow me.
Then like and subscribe.